Good afternoon. Welcome to Nino and the Rogue Elephant, the intelligence career of Antonin Scalia with James Rosen. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us. Our speaker today, James Rosen, is a veteran reporter and best-selling historian. He is exploring Justice Scalia's life in a two-volume biography. And the first volume has just debuted, and it focuses on Scalia rise to greatness 1936 to 1986. And James is also the chief White House correspondent for Newsmax. So we are really thrilled to have him here with us today. And he will focus on Scalia's life before he became a federal judge and consequential justice on the Supreme Court. Before that, Scalia served in the Nixon and Ford administrations, and amid the turmoil of the post-Watergate era, he helped reform the intelligence community, worked to preserve the executive powers of the presidency, and provided legal authorization for covert operations. Now, we're going to dig into that during the program, all those various topics and more. After a presentation by James and some questions from me, we will turn the program to your questions. Just a reminder, please use the Q&A feature to write them in, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. Now, before I turn over to James, I always like to connect our speaking, our programs to the museum. And so just a quick look at a related topic in our top secret gallery at the museum. This was yesterday. A lady is deeply watching a video from the time period in our top secret gallery. And in this gallery, that is where we explore the fallout from COINTELPRO. And this FBI program, there we go. This FBI program was revealed by a break-in to an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania in the early 1970s. So that's the larger case where we contextualize COINTELPRO. And then this close-up, the classified documents that were stolen from the office pictured here were a contributing factor to the intel reform of the 1970s, which we're going to hear about. And that's a sketch of Bonnie Raines, who was one of the activist burglars who broke in. All right, James, thanks for letting me put this in the context of the museum. I will go away for just a few moments. Summon me back whenever you wish.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you to the Spy Museum for having me today. This is a return of sorts for me. It was about a year ago at this time that I was privileged to moderate a panel for the Spy Museum, again, virtually on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Watergate arrests back on June 17, 1972. And you just mentioned the COINTELPRO, which was a notorious set of FBI operations, really from probably the 1950s until the early 1970s. And I wrote extensively about COINTELPRO for my first book, which was a biography of Attorney General John Mitchell. That book was called The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate. And a little known fact about the burglary at the FBI warehouse offices in Media, Pennsylvania, where a bunch of activists turned professional burglars and locksmith experts pulled off one of the great heists in American history and made off with thousands of pages of internal FBI documents that chronicled the existence and the maintenance of the COINTELPRO operations. That burglary took place, as you mentioned, in Media, Pennsylvania, at that unremarkable looking FBI office on March 8, 1971. And the reason the burglars chose that day and that evening was because that was the evening of the first Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier fight, which was billed as the fight of the century and is still cited as such by some boxing historians, where you had two undisputed, undefeated heavyweight champions going up against each other for the first time in history. The entire world was riveted on that event. It was known just as the fight in Madison Square Garden. And the burglars in the FBI COINTELPRO case literally chose that day because they knew that the security at that FBI facility, minimal as it was, and everyone else around the world would be focused on the Ali Frazier fight. Our subject, of course,
That is so cool, James. I don't know if I ever knew that. What a great detail. What a great strategic plan.
so there's much more that's fascinating about that case and the theft of those documents and the impact they had. The best book about it was written by one of the original Washington Post reporters who received one of the first batches of crudely photocopied FBI documents. That the burglars took the documents that they stole out into a remote location in the woods where they had installed a copy machine, and they started mailing out the copies of the documents anonymously or to different reporters. And the young female reporter, I think her name was Betty Medgar, who received the first batch of these documents way back in 1971, while J. Edgar Hoover was still alive. Never left the case, if you will. The burglary went unsolved, and the identities of the burglars who pulled off this extraordinary heist of FBI documents, they were never revealed until Betty published a book about it. I want to say around 2012. I reviewed that book for the Wall Street Journal, and when we're done here today, if you go to my Twitter feed at James Rosen TV, I will link our participants and our viewers to that article, my book review for the Wall Street Journal of this book about the theft of the COINTELPRO documents.
James, when it came out, not to get us too off track, but we had a panel at the Spy Museum, and we had the Rainses and Betty Metzger, and what a wild story that they had stayed undercover for so long.
Well, I'm grateful that the Spy Museum has given this the attention it deserves. And I'm grateful too that we can focus today on my latest book, which is just out, which is called Scalia, Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986. This tells the story of Antonin Scalia's first 50 years. It ends with him taking his seat on the Supreme Court. And so I hope I'll be back at some point. I'll have to figure out an intelligence angle. I'm sure there will be one when some 2 years from now, I publish the second and final installment in this 2-volume biography, which will focus on Justice Scalia's Supreme Court years, 1986 to his death in 2016. What most folks probably don't know about Justice Scalia, who of course was one of the most well-known, most controversial, and most consequential Supreme Court justices of our age. Indeed, I would say he is one of the most important Americans of the last 100 years. Due to the profound impact that Justice Scalia had, not only on the rulings in the law, but the way that lawyers, lawmakers, judges, and justices conceive of the law and treat the law today, which affects the lives of every one of America's citizens still today. Most people would probably not know that Antonin Scalia, in his career in the federal government, prior to becoming a federal judge and then a justice on the Supreme Court, had a lot to do with America's intelligence community. The justice, before he became a judge and a justice, he graduated top of his class in high school, in top of his class at Georgetown University, and then top 5 of his class from Harvard Law School. He practiced private sector law for 6.5 years at Jones Day, where he got a good grounding in all the different areas of the law, such as private practice affords. He taught at UVA Law School. His first job in the government was to serve as general counsel when Scalia was just about 35 years old. This is 1971. For a brand new agency that was created by the Nixon administration. It was called the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy. The Nixon administration realized that telecom was the future and recognized that at the moment that President Nixon took office, telecommunications policy for the federal government was a riot of different overlapping agencies with no real coordination. So they decided to consolidate control of federal telecom policy under the administrative aegis of the White House. Scalia was the general counsel, and he played a hugely important role at that time in the early 70s in launching the telecom revolution that gave us the digital landscape that we have today. Principally, Scalia and the director of that agency, a genius named Tom Whitehead, they worked together on a policy called Open Skies, and this enabled any qualified private company out there to launch a domestic space satellite into space. They applied free market principles to what had been a monopoly on the launching of domestic space satellites. And this turbocharged the telecom revolution. Scalia wrote a paper, its contents published here for the first time in Scalia Rise to Greatness, called The Computer Society. This was 1971, when Scalia predicted that the users of remote computer terminals in the future would not only have access to hundreds of channels of cable television, but would do their banking from these terminals and even would be able to retrieve information from just about every library in the world. Scalia also, so in essence, Antonin Scalia predicted the internet. He was savvy about technology from a young age. He also predicted the privacy concerns that would arise, as well as the huge financial impact of telecom. That was in the Nixon administration. In 1974, in the closing days of the Nixon presidency, less than a month before the collapse of the Nixon presidency, Antonin Scalia was nominated by or appointed by President Nixon to serve as the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice. It's a large, unwieldy title, and people have struggled to come up with a pithier description of this job, the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice. And the one that stuck is the President's lawyer's lawyer. Basically, anyone in the executive branch, from the president on down, who wants to know if a particular course of action or program or initiative is lawful or unlawful under the Constitution, can ask the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel for a binding legal opinion. And that's the job that Scalia held from 1974 to 1977. Previously, this job had been held at one point by William Rehnquist, who was the Assistant Attorney General for OLC under President Nixon at the time that Nixon nominated William Rehnquist to serve on the Supreme Court. Indeed, this book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, in furtherance of that open skies policy on the launching of domestic space satellites, contains previously undiscovered correspondence between Antonin Scalia and William Rehnquist in 1971, when Rehnquist was dispensing the legal opinions and Scalia needed one. And so I call this correspondence between these two men the first and only time where Antonin Scalia tasked William Rehnquist with drafting an opinion. When they both got to be on the Supreme Court, it was the other way around, of course, when Rehnquist was Chief Justice and he assigned the opinions when he was in the majority. Come the post-Watergate era, as I say, President Nixon appoints Antonin Scalia to this very important position at the Department of Justice. Unfortunately for Nixon, he resigns from office amid the Watergate scandal a few weeks later, and the Scalia nomination is in limbo. It was unclear whether he was going to be kept in that appointment by the new president, Gerald R. Ford, who of course is the only president in American history who had never been elected to the presidency or the vice presidency. In the end, Ford elected to keep Scalia where he was, and Scalia was confirmed by the US Senate. He started on his job, his new job at the Department of Justice, in August 1974. Later, as a justice on the Supreme Court, Scalia liked to boast that his commission papers for this job at DOJ in the post-Watergate era are something of his commission paper would be something of a collector's item, because the official language that appears on a presidential commission states that I, the President of the United States, undersigned, do hereby appoint and nominate. But in fact, Ford hadn't appointed and Richard Nixon had. And so the language was tailored specifically for Scalia's commission paper to account for that anomaly. The very first assignment that Scalia received when he showed up at the Department of Justice in late August 1974, a point at which we have to remember Richard Nixon had resigned and was living in brooding exile in San Clemente. He had not been pardoned yet by Gerald Ford. And the first question that the White House, the Ford White House, wanted a legal opinion on from Antonin Scalia was, who owns the Nixon tapes? It was a question that wasn't entirely divorced from intelligence considerations, given all of the national security information contained on President Nixon's 3,700 hours of tape recordings. Scalia came to the conclusion that just as all the presidents before him, Richard Nixon owned his papers and tapes. And when that determination by the Assistant Attorney General, Antonin Scalia, was made public by the Department of Justice, in tandem with President Ford's announcement that he had pardoned Richard Nixon, it caused a great uproar. And it prompted Congress to move swiftly to seize control of the Nixon tapes. However, many years later, in the year 2000, by which point Scalia was on the Supreme Court as a sitting justice, the federal government agreed, after a ruling by the Court of Appeals, one rung below the Supreme Court, that actually Scalia was right all the way back in 1974. Nixon did have an ownership interest in his papers and tapes, and the federal government compensated the Nixon estate to the tune of $18 million. But very quickly after that first assignment, the very next assignment Scalia received plunged him right into the heart of the American intelligence community. The question was whether, post-Watergate and following the revelation of many abuses of charter and power by the intelligence community dating back decades, CIA still could legally, when involved in cases of foreign intelligence, send its agents overseas to foreign countries and there install what were called trespassory microphone installations. In other words, conduct break-ins at foreign sites or sites related to foreign intelligence cases and install microphones there for the purposes of wiretapping and surveillance. And this book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, among the many sets of documents that have never been published before, one of them is an opinion that Scalia prepared in this job at the Department of Justice, Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel, in which he found that there were limitations on what CIA agents could do in foreign intelligence cases in terms of the installation of these trespassory microphones in foreign intelligence cases. And Scalia prepared I think it was a 17-page opinion that had remained classified until recently. Its contents published here for the first time. And when the CIA director at that time, the legendary William Colby, got a hold of Scalia's paper, in which Scalia found limitations on what CIA could do in these foreign intelligence cases, let's just say the CIA director was not happy. There's a great scene in Scalia Rise to Greatness where the CIA director confronts Antonin Scalia about this, young Antonin Scalia, at agency headquarters in Langley. And how this was rough sledding, this meeting for Scalia. And in the end, behind Scalia's back, the CIA director, William Colby, drafted a memorandum, also previously unpublished until now, that went to President Ford, basically seeking to conduct an end run around Scalia's legal findings and make the case, in essence, that CIA could do whatever it wanted in these foreign intelligence installations. And in fact, so audacious was the director in this previously unpublished memorandum to President Ford that he basically told the president, this will be the policy unless you indicate otherwise. In other words, making the president have to opt out. And in the end, this was rejected by the Ford White House, and Scalia's position and Scalia's legal findings were upheld by the Ford White House. This was just one of a number of extraordinary experiences that Scalia had in this job at the Department of Justice, interfacing with the American intelligence community. It got to the point that post-Watergate, so gun-shy was the Ford White House about conducting different kinds of covert operations and whether they would be lawful or not, that they started running covert operations, all covert operations, past Antonin Scalia, who was not yet 40 years old at the time, for approval. And the story is told in this book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, again for the first time anywhere, of how on the afternoon of April 30, 1975, Scalia received a call from the Ford White House where they said, we need your opinion within just a few hours on this. Would it be lawful under the War Powers Act of 1973 for American military helicopters to land on the roof of the American embassy in Saigon amid the fall of Saigon that very day to evacuate American personnel by that means? And of course, we're all familiar with those historic and iconic images of American personnel and Vietnamese collaborators and others being lifted onto helicopters from the roof of the American embassy on that fateful day, April 30, 1975. Scalia did provide the legal authorization, saying that it would be lawful for US military under the War Powers Act to conduct this operation. But he said later, and this is published for the first time in Scalia Rise to Greatness, what if I hadn't provided that legal authorization? Would they have called off this evacuation operation on advice of counsel? What is the world coming to? Scalia said. One of the people I interviewed for this project was called William Funk, who's still with us and who's a law professor out on the West Coast. He served as Scalia's deputy at the Department of Justice when Scalia held this job, Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel. And Funk worked directly with Scalia on the Nixon tapes case opinion and on a lot of these intelligence matters, precisely because Funk had served previously in military intelligence and retained his top security clearance. Scalia had held a security clearance previously in his job in the White House Office of Telecommunications Policy back in 1971. And Funk remembered for me an instance where the two of them had to go drive from the Department of Justice over to the Department of State in Foggy Bottom in Washington to go, and there that they were scheduled to receive and did receive the name of a particular CIA asset, a foreigner overseas, who could be targeted for assassination. And Scalia said to Funk on the car ride over, the limo ride over, "This is crazy. Why am I receiving this information?" In short, it was a strange experience for Antonin Scalia, self-described kid from Queens, to find himself in the post-Watergate era, standing literally astride the American intelligence apparatus and providing thumbs up or thumbs down, approval or rejection of specific covert operations. The other roles that Scalia played with the intelligence community at this time were twofold. One, being that this was the post-Watergate period, there was a determined push on the part of Democrats controlling Congress, liberals in the media, in essence to emasculate the presidency, to transfer power from the executive to the legislature and, if necessary, to the courts. And as part of that assault on the powers of the presidency, there was an effort in tandem to emasculate the intelligence communities. There were calls at the time for the abolition of the intelligence community, similar to what we've later heard, for example, in terms of a movement to defund the police. Scalia stood athwart all of that at the time. Scalia and a tight cadre of conscientious conservative lawyers at that time, and other conservative officials, including Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who worked in the Ford administration, and others, all recognized that after Watergate and its subsidiary scandals faded from the headlines, the country would still need a strong executive. And so they worked both behind the scenes and publicly in terms of testifying before Congress and in other venues to preserve the powers of the executive and the presidency and of the intelligence community for a period when there would be less of a frenzy surrounding these activities. And Scalia did this in two ways. One, privately by drafting these legal opinions. And Scalia Rise to Greatness has a lot of draft opinions by Scalia where you could see his compositional method at work. You can see him scratching out certain phrases and others being used, or sometimes his superiors at the White House scratching out a very pungent Scalia expression and putting in something perhaps a little tamer. But also in public, Scalia would testify before congressional committees repeatedly. I call him in the book Il Matador, because Scalia was a debate champion from his Jesuit education days in high school and in college. He literally was a champion debater. He could also conjugate Latin verbs in 60 seconds under the threat of a stopwatch. There was nobody on Capitol Hill at that time, whether it was Ed Muskie or Ron Dellums or any of the lesser known figures from Congress in those days, who could possibly compare to Scalia in his mastery of rhetoric, logic, the law, even the details of their own legislative proposals quite frequently. And one of the committees before which Scalia, accompanied by Bill Funk, testified at the time was the Pike Committee. And to regular attendees of events here at the International Spy Museum, the Pike Committee will be well known alongside the Church Committee as one of two select committees that were formed in the wake of Watergate to examine the activities of the intelligence community, which was described at the time by Senator Frank Church, chairman of the Church Committee, as a rogue elephant, thus our title today, Nino being the affectionate nickname that Scalia's family and friends used for him, the rogue elephant being the intelligence community at that time. And no one has really gone back until now and looked at Scalia's testimony before the Pike Committee and gone in depth, as we have here, on his work with the intelligence community. So it was a very profoundly consequential period. Scalia's work in intelligence matters still governs a lot of how the intelligence community works today. And of course, as a justice on the Supreme Court, he later had opportunities to rule in cases that involved the collection of foreign intelligence, particularly after the 9/11 attacks. And his rulings in this area were formed in part by his experiences, what he called being under siege in the post-Watergate era, when there were a lot of greedy and reckless ideas flying around on Capitol Hill and in the news media about how to treat the executive, the presidency, and the intelligence community. And Scalia stood up when it was least fashionable to do so in terms of an age of radical chic and in the post-Watergate era, to stand up for the executive, to stand up for the presidency and for the intelligence community. When defending executive privilege before Congress in 1973, Scalia famously said that he recognized that defending executive privilege in the current season post-Watergate was akin to showing up and preaching the values of water right after the Johnstown flood. But in any case, his work in this area is still with us, as surely as his work remains with us in terms of his having been a Supreme Court justice. So I'm grateful to the International Spy Museum to give me this opportunity to discuss this phase of this section of the book, which, as I say, draws on a lot of previously unpublished memoranda, correspondence, opinions, draft opinions that I secured with the assistance of the excellent archivists out at the Ford Library. And I'd be happy to take your and anyone else's questions.
Thank you, James. That was quite a spectacular overview, and I hate to make you excise just a section of this life that you are so committed to, but thank you for really laser focusing it on intelligence, because obviously that's our audience. You mentioned, just to briefly revert to the title, you mentioned that the rogue elephant was the CIA in this phrase, but could you tell us a little bit more about why the CIA was being called, why someone would call it the rogue elephant, even if they were not actually correct in the long run about that?
After the revelations of Watergate, there followed a series of bombshell revelations by some of the same reporters who had investigated Watergate, most notably, I would say, Cy Hirsch, then of the New York Times, exposing wholesale violations of CIA's charter over the preceding 25 years. And it was Director William Colby, who I interviewed for my previous book on Watergate, alongside Director Richard Helms, his predecessor, whom I also interviewed. It was Director Colby who ultimately made available to congressional investigators and then the larger public what was known at the time as the crown jewels. And this was several hundred pages of internal CIA documents that chronicled the various transgressions by CIA into areas precluded by the agency's charter, which focused mostly on the unlawfulness of CIA conducting operations on domestic soil or against American targets who are not part of some foreign intelligence case. And so because of the litany of such instances, CIA earned at that time the sobriquet of rogue elephant. It's also worth pointing out, and here I would draw on my work on Watergate, that the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in Watergate has attracted a lot of revisionist scholarly attention since President Nixon resigned in 1974, and I count myself proudly among those revisionists. I subscribe to what Oscar Wilde said about history, which is that our lone duty to it is continually to rewrite it. And a mass of archival evidence has become available since 1974, which shows a much more complex and even controlling role for CIA in the outcome of the Watergate break-in and surveillance operation at the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and perhaps in the overall fate of Richard Nixon. Indeed, it's my reporting that, for example, that the one Cuban burglar at Watergate who was arrested on June 17, 1972, who was at that very moment on the payroll of CIA, Eugenio Rolando Martinez. Come a few years later, John S. Warner, who was the general counsel to CIA in the Watergate era, and who was present for Director Colby's great showdown with Antonin Scalia that I referenced earlier, yeah, which is explained in Scalia Rise to Greatness. I was the first reporter back, I think in 2016, to publish the contents of an internal history of CIA involvement in Watergate, which Judicial Watch had sued and pried loose from the federal government after many years of secrecy. It's about 150 pages long. In that document, John Warner, the general counsel for CIA, basically stiff-armed a demand from the Watergate special prosecutors for the complete personnel files of Eugenio Martinez, And Warner said that they would fight this to the death under subpoena if it came to it, because the reason being, as Warner put it, they would not want to breach, quote, the trust of an agent. And when that internal history was first published by this reporter in 2016, and I'll link our viewers to it on my Twitter feed at the end, at James Rosen TV. Again, here you have in writing the general counsel of CIA stating affirmatively that the agency had an agent on the break-in team of Watergate, and would not part with his personnel files to the Watergate special prosecutors, would fight any subpoena from the prosecutors to the death, because they would not breach the trust of an agent. That, in tandem with many other facts and new documents that have come to light, have cast an entirely new role on CIA in the Watergate drama. And to my mind, that dimension also contributes to the accuracy of that term, rogue elephant.
What, you detail it in the book, but how was Scalia and Colby's relationship after this experience where Colby's trying to do an end run around this very young man? So I wonder if they went on.
Well, what happened was that after this great showdown in 1974, where the Attorney General at the time, Bill Saxby, who was kind of a sleepy fellow, but who stuck up for Scalia in this extraordinary moment, Saxby and Scalia are summoned to CIA headquarters in Langley to have this showdown with the CIA director, who was himself a legendary figure by this point, William Colby, a World War II veteran, someone who presided over the Phoenix program in Vietnam and so on, to have this showdown where Saxby and Scalia are summoned by Colby and the general counsel, John Warner, whose most recent accomplishment was telling the Watergate special prosecutors to stuff it when they wanted the personnel files of one of the Watergate burglars. This was a heady moment for Scalia, and it was rough sledding. And this encounter, like a lot else in Scalia's life, was misrepresented, I would say, by Scalia's previous two biographers, both of whom were hostile. And what was ironic about it was that after the CIA director's end run around Scalia failed, Colby and Warner then found themselves facing Scalia in daily morning meetings in the Situation Room of the National Security Council, because of the role that Scalia now had in approving or rejecting covert operations, and in determining which secrets on a daily basis were supposed to be turned over to the Church or Pike committees that day, with, as Scalia put it, scant assurance that they wouldn't turn up the following day in the Washington Post. Scalia was a presence at these meetings on a daily basis, and Warner and Colby just kind of had to deal with it.
So, and thank you for, of course he was young, but for really saying not yet 40 when he's approving all the covert operations. Did you get any sense of how he felt about that power or burden or duty?
First of all, it's worth pointing out that even today, the majority of Scalia's work on covert matters remains classified and inaccessible to researchers. But that which has surfaced, and I'm proud to have brought some new material to the table in this book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, stemming from Scalia's work on intelligence matters, that which has surfaced is sufficient to show us that he was being consulted regularly on the most sensitive diplomatic, political, military, and intelligence secrets. And he was ambivalent about it. And in those anecdotes I told earlier, where he's basically saying to his deputy as they're riding a limousine from the Department of Justice over to the State Department, this is crazy. Why am I being invested with this knowledge of the name of a foreign asset overseas? He would bring Bill Funk with him on these occasions because he demanded that he have a witness. It just, I think it was a role that Scalia never saw or sought for himself, to be standing astride the American intelligence colossus and providing thumbs up or thumbs down on discrete covert operations.
One of my colleagues that you know well from doing our programs together said, how did James meet Scalia?
So yes, I was privileged to know Justice Scalia a little bit. When I was in high school back in the 1980s, I saw him participate in a PBS program called The Constitution, That Delicate Balance. And it was hosted by a moderator, Fred Friendly, who was the nebbishy former president of CBS News. And this program convened panels of eminent thinkers from the time. So you had Dan Rather and Antonin Scalia, or Sandra Day O'Connor, Gerald Ford, all sorts of, Alexander Haig, all sorts of different people gathered in a theater in the round type setting with a live studio audience where they contemplated hypotheticals from their different disciplinary perspectives. And Scalia just struck me immediately as fundamentally unlike the other participants in this program. He spoke in layman's terms, which was very important to him. And this whole book, Scalia Rise to Greatness, is written for a lay audience. Lawyers will love it, but so will ordinary folks who are not lawyers. And that was very important to him in his work on intelligence matters, in his work on regulatory matters as a judge, as a justice. It was very important to him, and he stated this explicitly, that he believed that everything that the government published should be readily understandable to ordinary folks who are not lawyers or technicians. And in any case, as he progressed in the Ford administration, he took on this role where he was responsible for this array of activities, but always wanting to make sure that the public could understand him.
Do you think, as you said, he never wanted to stand above, the giant intelligence apparatus of this country? Do you think, did he develop a particular interest in it? Was it, I mean, he had such a broad mind, or do you think that experience directly with it influenced later thinking for him, or developed a really special inside look into it, or was he kind of glad to leave that piece behind?
He didn't have any particular history with the subject matter, but I think he found it fascinating. And he came to regard that a vibrant intelligence community is essential to the functioning of a democratic republic in a globalized age. And after 9/11, Scalia explicitly in his remarks drew a connection between the attempted emasculation of the intelligence community and the intelligence lapses that preceded 9/11. Just to go back to your previous question, I realized I failed to get there and answer how I met the man. So when I got to Washington in 1999 as a young correspondent at the time for Fox News, one of the first things I did was write to him to seek an interview. And this commenced between us a lengthy and frequently amusing correspondence that spanned about 2 years. And it led to a pair of lunches that we had together, one on each occasion, just the two of us, where we drank wine. He made me eat vegetables off of his plate. I said, Mr. Justice, I couldn't. He's like, come on, come on, come on. So now I'm 30-year-old me is shoveling vegetables off Justice Scalia's plate into my mouth. And he even drove me back to my office on each occasion in his car, which was a somewhat unnerving experience. These lunches were at his favorite place, now long gone, called AV Ristorante Italiano, which is
Oh, I
modest
remember
place,
that. I remember that.
a
That's so
modest
fun.
place
Yeah,
located in what was then a fairly sketchy neighborhood in
yeah,
Washington.
yeah.
And I'll tell you one funny story. The substantive contents of our discussions at lunch, which were historically significant in my mind, will remain off the record. I do hope to publish in volume 2 from our
Oh,
correspondence. But I was the first to get there. And the place was long. It had a long sort of chute from the front door, and it was dark generally. And sunlight was flooding in through the front door. And finally, a silhouetted figure, somewhat portly and jaunty, strolls towards me. And it's Justice Scalia. This was 1999. And I was 30. And he sits down and he looks at the menu. And our waiter, a young guy, was genuinely from Italy, and he spoke in broken English. And Justice Scalia says, "Pulpy, what is pulpy?" And he looks up at the waiter, and the waiter says, "Octopus." And he goes, "Octopus." And Scalia says, "I'll have the pulpy." And he hands the menu to the guy. Now, I have little rules about when I'm lunching or dining with someone on whom I'm trying to make a good impression, Amanda. I try and avoid food that you eat with your hands, or things that will splash on you, etc. So things that are easily manipulable with a knife and fork. And I come from Staten Island, which when I grew up there at least was 66% Italian. So I knew exactly what to order. And I just said, "I'll have the veal parmesan," I said to the guy. And he's writing it down. And Justice Scalia interrupts and he says, "No, no, give him the rabbit." And the
Oh,
waiter and I
okay.
look at each other and we just turn to the justice in unison and say, rabbit. He goes, yeah, yeah, you're gonna like the rabbit. Give him the rabbit. And the guy takes my menu and disappears. Now,
I'm from the
I,
country. I've eaten plenty of rabbit, but I know
but
it's not for everyone.
I mentioned that I'm from Staten Island,
I
and
don't think you've eaten a lot of rabbit.
so I had never had rabbit. I didn't want rabbit. And basically what you have here is the country's foremost opponent of judicial activism overruling my lunch order. Okay, which that hasn't happened to me since. And I'll tell you the truth, I haven't had rabbit since either. But it was a remarkable moment. Just and there, the thing was served to me, and I don't know anything about it, and I don't know if it's like a fish where they serve it with the head on or whatever. And
Oh
there
no,
was
you
some
poor
little,
thing.
there was some little ball of which, in my mind's eye, looking back now, looked resembled like guacamole or something. And I made the mistake of plunging my fork into this substance and realizing that in order to maintain the eye contact with Justice Scalia and keep the conversation going without interruption, I was just going to have to stick my fork full of this stuff into my mouth without any idea of what it was or what it was going to taste like. And I just did so and swallowed it and kept nodding. And to this day, I have no idea what that was.
I'm confused. I've eaten lots of rabbit in Italian restaurants in Greece, and of course, like I said, I grew up in the country. We've eaten rabbit, but I don't know what you put in your mouth, you poor thing.
I'm still
But
here.
you followed the orders of your
The-
prey. You were on the hunt to make a good impression, and so good for you on that. Well, you mentioned driving with him, and I get the feeling, I was not aware of this, but in reading the materials, reading about the book. Tell us a bit about, just because we teased that in our write-up, why was driving with him so memorable?
Well, I guess different folks had different experiences, but I can confirm through my research that having interviewed classmates of Scalia's from the 1950s who traveled with him for debate tournaments, all the way up through my interviews with clerks who served in his chambers at the Supreme Court in the 21st century, that being a passenger in a car driven by Antonin Scalia was as unnerving an experience for them as it proved for me. For example, one of those classmates told me that young Nino Scalia would get too involved in the debates and too involved in the conversations, and his focus on the road would lapse a bit to the point where they would gingerly take the steering wheel away from him and say, "We're going to relieve you now, Nino." And when I told one of his clerks from the 21st century that I had been a passenger in his car on 2 occasions, the clerk said to me, "God help you." There were stories I can't even publish about this particular trait of his, this ineptitude at the wheel. When I was his passenger, I saw it play out in a bit of leaning on the horn, maybe a little profanity, a little, tiny little display of what some might consider to be road rage. And of course, there was a famous incident in 2011 when, as a justice, he got into an accident deemed to be his fault, where 4 cars were involved on the George Washington Parkway. So I consider myself fortunate to have benefited from his kindness and generosity to a young reporter a quarter century ago, but also to have survived the experience.
Yeah, justices, they're just like us, or not, because we don't get in these accidents. Well, I did to get this. This is a question from our audience. I know it's one you're very prepared to answer, but I didn't expect it from our Intel folks. One of our guests was wondering about Scalia and his Catholicism, and in particular, our guest asked if he was a member of Opus Dei.
Scalia was not a member of Opus Dei, but he had many friends who were, and he participated in religious retreats with
Mhm.
Opus Dei priests. One Opus Dei priest still with us in his late 80s, still blogging, still actively preaching, still sharp of memory and logic and locution, is Father Robert Connor. Father Bob, as he's affectionately known, was one of 3 individuals that I could ascertain in my research who was a member of Scalia's 1953 graduating class at Xavier High School in Manhattan, and who was still with us. Interestingly, one of the other, I interviewed all 3, Another was a guy who's still with us named Tom Campion, who himself became a lawyer and later hired Professor Scalia to write briefs for appellate litigation. And the third was Wilbur Ross, who was President Trump's Commerce Secretary, but who did not know Antonin Scalia in high school. But Father Bob did, and Father Bob Connor was very close with Scalia. The two of them were in the marching band together. They were in a photograph in the center of the photograph section of Scalia Rise to Greatness. They played hoops together. Young Nino Scalia set young Bob Connor up on at least one date. They took girls to dances together. They knew each other well. And in fact, Bob Connor, Father Connor told me that his own father, Jim Connor, used to see Scalia when, as a teenager, Scalia, who was already so gifted at debate, would appear on student debate and quiz show programs, both on television and radio. A number of those appearances in the 1950s. Unfortunately, none of the tapes or videotapes or films survive, or recordings. But it got to the point where he was such a regular that Bob Connor's own father would say, "Oh, you should have seen Scalia this week, Bob. He really gave it to him this week." I mean, Scalia had fans as a teenager via electronic media. In the summer of 1959, the two had been very close, but they were starting to drift. Now, at this point, they're each 23 years old. Scalia has finished his second year at Harvard Law. He has taken an internship for the summer with a Midwestern law firm in Milwaukee. And Bob Connor has decided that he's going to drop out of medical school and go study Opus Dei in Rome. And Mrs. Connor, his mother, is distraught that her son is throwing away his future. So she summons to the Connor family home two men whom she thought might be able to talk sense into her son. One was a Jesuit priest named Father Morrison, who came and went without any impact. And as Father Bob Connor recounted this to me, first of all, the first question I asked him in our interview, our lengthy interview in December of 2020, was who else had ever interviewed him about his decades-long relationship with Antonin Scalia? No one. How about the FBI? No, I would have remembered that. Scalia was investigated 4 times for background checks by the FBI as he rose through the executive and judicial branches within a 14-year period. And there are hundreds of pages of FBI documents in his file, published here for the first time, which just show the highest of testimonials in each one of these outings. As I say in the book, would that all lives paid such close scrutiny would reward with such sterling testimonials. So Father Bob had never told this story to anyone before. It appears here for the first time. I regard Father Connor as an unimpeachable source, and I regard what he has to say on this matter as definitive in settling what really was the only enduring mystery of Scalia's life, which was, when did this ambition to sit on the Supreme Court first begin to burn within the young Antonin Scalia? So it's July 1959. Bob Connor is sitting in, as he described it, his brother's bedroom on the second floor of the Connor family home on the south side of Downey Road in Jamaica, Queens. And in walks Nino Scalia into his brother's bedroom, and he's stunned to see him. And Scalia turns his palms upwards and says, "What are you doing?" And as Father Bob recounted it to me, he said to Scalia, "I'm going to go study Opus Dei in Rome." And I said, as devout a Catholic as Scalia was and remained for the rest of his life, at that time in 1959, did young Nino Scalia have any idea what Opus Dei was? And Father Connors told me, I explained it to him that we find the sanctity in everyday things, everyday life. And Scalia nodded and said, "Sounds good to me." And again, this had never been related until now, until the pages of Scalia Rise to Greatness. Connor said back to Scalia, "What are you doing?" And Scalia said to him, "I'm going to the Supreme Court." And Connor said to him, "How are you going to do that?" And as he related it to me, he said, "James, he had a law firm job lined up for after law school with some firm in Ohio." I said, "Jones Day." He goes, "Yes, that was it." And in fact, Scalia spent his first 6 years of his professional life after law school practicing in the private sector for Jones Day in Cleveland. He says, "Yes, it was Jones Day." Scalia said to me, "They have a Washington office. I will be sent to Washington and I will rise." And I said, "Did this strike you as comical or fanciful that he said this?" He said, No, Nino was driven." I said, "Did he seem to regard this as a divine calling?" And he said, I bet." And the way Father Connor put it to me was, this was a convergence of 2 transcendent moments where 2 young men about to embark on their careers and really at the outset of their professional lives, dear friends from middle school days, say to each other, "Where are you going?" And one says, "I'm going to God," and the other says, "I'm going to the Supreme Court." It's extraordinary, and it settles this mystery once and for all. But in book 2, there will be a lot of interviews with people who were Opus Dei priests and who took Scalia on spiritual retreats.
So that is so interesting. So I think that frequent spy program guest who took us, because I wouldn't have introduced that topic if it hadn't come from our audience. And a guest also wanted to know, was Scalia in the Federalist Society?
Well, Scalia was one of the architects of the Federalist Society. One of the people interviewed for the book and who provides a blurb on the back cover of the book is Lee Lieberman Otis. She is a senior executive at the Federalist Society. She clerked for Scalia both on the Court of Appeals for the DC Circuit and then for the Supreme Court. She is one of that really is an elite ring of what Scalia called the clerkerati, those who clerked for him both on the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. And at the University of Chicago Law School in 1982, when Scalia was a professor there, it was Lee Lieberman Otis who approached him and asked, would he serve as the inaugural faculty advisor for this new chapter of this new group that was being set up called the Federalist Society? And Scalia did so. And his assistance at that time was seminal and remained so. And there's a section of our book, of the book Scalia Rise to Greatness, where I detail the growth of the Federalist Society and Scalia's extraordinary contribution there too.
All right, now this one's purely a question from me and hearkening back to a little bit of our Watergate talk from the past. What have you seen the White House Plumbers show?
No, I'm getting old enough to recognize when I'm going to really be bothered by fictionalized TV content and should just stay away. The same is true for Gaslit, which purported to tell the story of John and Martha Mitchell.
Right.
The Nixon Frost movie. I would rather watch 2 hours of the actual Nixon Frost tapes. And this treatment of Hunt and Liddy as comic bunglers is completely inaccurate. The Watergate story is much more interesting. And if you read my book, The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate, you'll see that the real purpose of the Watergate break-in and surveillance operation at the Democratic National Committee headquarters was to spy on a particular telephone that was being used at that time, the spring of 1972, to set up dates between Democrats who'd come in to Washington from out of town and a call girl ring that was being operated out of the Columbia Plaza apartment complex 2 blocks from the Watergate. Right. And this is a revisionist theory. It's not my theory to begin with, but all the evidence that I found corroborated it. And even the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has corroborated the accuracy of the so-called call girl theory of Watergate.
Wow, that is, well, we'll stay tuned to that space and watch that story. Like you said, there's always, I think that's why I love history, because there's always something new to learn or think about or explore. And that leads me to a question that we got about how, so we have lots of historians, we have former intel experts, you're a journalist, you're a reporter. How does that impact what you write about, how you research, or does it?
I should hope there's some connection between my day-to-day discipline and the production of these books. It's been said of portrait artists that an essential ingredient in all successful portraiture is caricature. So I would imagine that it is also fair to say that anybody who is writing a good or successful biography is functioning as a historian. And I would say that anyone who's functioning as a historian is exercising the skills of a reporter. And so I've covered the White House, I've covered the Department of State, I've been to 50 plus foreign countries. I've covered, the 9/11 hearings. I've covered many intelligence episodes, incidents. So yeah, I like to think there's a direct connection between what I do as a day-to-day reporter. It's that, and the production of historically accurate books. It comes down to as it would for an intelligence or analyst or even an agent, a clandestine agent, obtaining information, reviewing it, assessing it, corroborating it, and then synthesizing it. Some of our viewers will doubtless remember that about a decade ago, I became the news when it was disclosed that the Obama administration had spied on me and had placed me under surveillance in connection with my reporting on North Korea, specifically its nuclear weapons program and the succession program that wound up putting Kim Jong-un into power. And there was a novel designation of me at the time by the Obama administration, first and only time in American history, to my knowledge, where a working reporter had been designated a criminal co-conspirator in a violation of the Espionage Act for doing his job. And this produced an acknowledgement from the Attorney General, Eric Holder, at the time, that this was the biggest regret of his tenure in that job. President Obama, speaking at National Defense University on counterterrorism, paused to address the Rosen case. And so he then appointed Eric Holder, the person who was responsible for this novel designation, to get to the bottom of how it happened. But to keep it in perspective, not even Neil Sheehan, who had published the Pentagon Papers for the New York Times in 1971, 7,000 pages of classified documents tracing the arc of American involvement in Southeast Asia, had been thusly designated by the Nixon administration. The FBI agent who signed a sworn affidavit that included this designation of me as a co-conspirator in a criminal violation of the Espionage Act stated in that document, which was held under seal for a year and a half longer legally than it was supposed to be, stated in that document that Rosen functions with his sources like an intelligence officer. He recruits them, wow. He employs secret codes with them for communications, etc. And amid that entire ordeal, I will say that was one part of it that struck me almost as a professional compliment.
Wow. Yeah. Well, you've got to just take some of the goodness out of the badness. Obviously, you are a survivor. You survived 5 years working on this book. So now I'm gonna do that horrible thing that as a mom I do with my kid. Oh, you just did that. Okay, what's next? So when's the next book? When is volume 2 coming out, James?
This is like the mother-in-law who greets the news of a baby's birth with, so when you're having another.
When's the next one? Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm all those bad things, but done with love, just like mother-in-laws.
Well, you're quite right that I am deprived of any ability to celebrate the publication of volume 1, because volume 2 is very much hanging over my head. Mrs. Rosen was also less than pleased at the extension of this book into a second volume, because it meant attendant with that the extension by 2 years of Justice Scalia's lease on the lives of the Rosen family. So I'm hoping, I've got certainly good impetus to finish this quickly, and I'm hoping to be out in bookstores with it in September 2025.
Wonderful. Well, James, it has been really fascinating to talk to you. It always is. It's such an interesting perspective, and thank you for giving us a lot of your very valuable time. I hope folks will be inspired to read the book. I learned a lot, and some of these things kind of flashed through my consciousness as a kid, but it is always great to learn more. Our next virtual program, we have a long break, folks. We are not going to do another program until July 20th, and it's going to be very different from this, but very interesting. Former Navy SEAL Remy Adeleke has written our recommended summer beach read, which is Chameleon. So join us to hear about his career, his new, we don't usually do novels, but we think this will be neat. So check out our website to sign up for programs like this. Check out our YouTube channel. This program will be there in a week or shorter. And if you loved our program, please consider making a donation to SPY, which helps us make programs like this free, take care of our collections, do community outreach, and just all sorts of general great stuff. rush out, buy the book, follow James. We will send you his Twitter handle in the thank you. It's in the chat right now, because you promised us all sorts of good stuff if we get back on Twitter or stay on Twitter. I had to stay on for things like this. So thank you for all the links you are promising to share.
You bet. And thank you for this opportunity, Amanda. It was great to be back with you and with the Spy Museum.
All right, everyone, take care.